Okay, thank you very much for being so swift. My presentation is now. As you have recognized, time is quite short. So each presenter will have 7 minutes. At 5 minutes, I will stand up, and you will see me stand up and stand close to you. At 1 minute, I will move a little bit closer to you, and at 7 minutes, I'm going to remove your microphone. I hope the speakers are hearing. Okay, so each speaker, 7 minutes. That is 6 minutes and 59 seconds. Be prepared to have your microphone removed from you. The first speaker will be Shem, the second Kanani, the third Susan, the fourth John, and the fifth Ronald. And then we'll take questions on all 5 at the end, and depending on time, how much time we have depends on the number of questions. Okay, so I'm just going to go straight to John, to Shem, if I may, and if his presentation is ready. Are you ready, Shem? Fantastic. Go for it.
How many minutes do I have? 7 minutes. Okay, good morning. Yes, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to do the slides. All right. For the sake of the people who are online, I'm handling the mic. My discussion today is based on public participation in environmental issues, in environmental decision making, and as the title of my paper is, my argument is that in environmental issues, there should be a deeper or a higher threshold of participation, and I just don't call it public participation, I call it community engagement. The basis of my discussion, or the legal basis, will be Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, Article 10 of the Constitution of Kenya, and 42 of the Kenyan Constitution. National values that call for public participation and the right to clean environment. Now, my theoretical framework is indigenous custodianship. My argument is that the environment or nature belongs to the communities. For example, as Africans, it is our heritage given to us by past generations to us to safeguard it, own it, and then pass it over to future generations. And so, as you've heard from previous speakers, communities have evolved modes or cultures, practices, and norms, and folklores to preserve and conserve the environment. For example, some communities consider nature as members of community. Nature is divine, for example, among the Gikuyu, the Mugumo tree is holy. Mount Kenya is holy. Rivers, forests belong to communities. Animals represent good luck. For example, from my community, the Abagusi, for example, the women who will lose their babies for a long time will call their children after animals that they give them good luck, that they be able to live. Among the Luo, we have issues about, we talk about reincarnation. We believe that some animals maybe could be representing the living dead. And so this conception of our communities have led to effective preservation of the environment. And in fact, amongst our communities, the indigenous communities, you will not have had issues like extinction of animals or endangerment of some species. For example, the dodo only was extinct when people, the foreigners, came to Africa, and the rhino is now endangered because of foreign interest in the animal. Anyway, so the argument of this paper about deeper public engagement is that communities own the environment, and so they are entitled to be more engaged, and failure to be engaged is tantamount or is equated to contravention, dispossession, and And another thing that will also be underlined here is that the state does not have monopoly of knowledge on conservation. Communities have had possession or have been coexisting with the environment for so many years, hundreds and perhaps thousands, and the environment has been secure and has been safeguarded over generations. And so we cannot claim to have monopoly of knowledge. And so the public, when you're engaging the public, you are not just telling them that this is what you're going to do because it's good for you, but the public must also be involved to say that we think this is right because we've been doing it for hundreds of years. Now, I'll just move to the legal, how courts have decided on what is public. Looking at the Mui Basin case, there have been 4 grounds or 4 key grounds on what is public or who is the public. 1, persons who have strong interest in the outcome of the case or directly affected by the decision by the EDM, environmental decision making, and the observing public, the media, opinion leaders, and the general public that is not really affected but really interested in it. And we've had quite interesting cases. I think 1996 case on Hassan vs. KWS, where the court ruled that the decision by Kenya Wildlife Service to translocate a rare species of antelopes called Hirola antelope was wrong because the communities were not consulted. Community engagement. And this was another case about the Meza Galana case, about where there was a gazettement of Turner Primate Reserve to a national reserve, and this decision was rescinded because the community was not engaged. And so, so what really is participation? Trying to move very fast. There has to be prior information, right to be heard, and reasonable opportunity. I'm almost done, Prof. And so this has been given in the Mui Basin case. That's good. Now, the way forward, my question will be here is that, do their voices matter? That's the question. For example, looking at the Mui Basin case and even the British American tobacco case, the court has ruled that they can give views, but the views should not necessarily mean that they have to be incorporated. And so that is my bigger question. Why can't these communities be given a voice? And another thing that I want to talk about, the way forward of a higher threshold for public engagement in environmental issues, is that we need to incorporate the human rights parameters of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. For example, has information been disseminated? That is availability. And accessibility, for example, can the community, this mode of dissemination, for example, newspapers. This notice we give that we want public participation, and then you put it on newspaper. Does the rule of person get the newspaper, and can he revert back? Another is, for example, affordability and proxim. I mean, how, for example, when you put public engagement to be at a certain place, can the people access it? That's the question. And another thing that's so common is undue influence in public participation. I mean, like, we are paid to come and participate. Is it public participation? And another thing, acceptability. We have issues, for example, you were talking yesterday about men and women, patriarchal societies, all right? How do we incorporate women in public engagement in communities where women cannot sit together with men? And also, for example, religious aspects, for example, there are Muslims, there are Christians, and then you put public engagement in a church. Is it acceptable? And another aspect will be inclusivity that I talked about, women, the disabled, and all that. So there should be safeguards. And lastly, but not anyway, to close it is, do the communities gain? Should be a very important question in public participation. For example, it's very sad when we have hydroelectric projects or geothermal projects, and then where those projects are sourced from, for example, here in Olkaria, you find the communities do not have access to electricity, right? I think those communities should gain, first of all, in fact, free electricity. And so we should move from public engagement in environmental decision making should not just be a negative aspect like, or mitigating the effects, but also finding ways, or way forward for communities to gain. For example, we talk about carbon projects, right? And then you find communities really not gaining. I don't want to, the prof is very near here. And I think I will close it, and I think we'll have a deeper discussion on that. Thank you so much.
Well, he packed a lot into 8 minutes, didn't he? That was fantastic. Rights, do voices matter? Okay, so engage the community, but what's the meaning behind that? Nature as a member of the community. We're going to have some really interesting questions for Shem, aren't we, when we come to question time. Shem, thank you so much for being so disciplined and doing such a wonderful presentation in 8 minutes. Sorry for the pressure. You were the first to experience the pressure. Unfortunately for Kanani, he's going to have the same pressure. Very good. Please welcome Kanani.
I believe it's still good morning. Good morning. As they are setting up the slides, that's when you start counting our time, Prof. Okay. So then I was sitting down there and wondering, why would the framers of the 2010 Constitution entrench public participation in our Constitution, but then fail to provide parameters of public participation? Because there are more than 14 articles in our Constitution of Kenya 2010 talking about public participation. Why would these framers then even provide time limits on a legislation that sets forth on how public participation is to be executed? So I hope this discussion you're going to have, though limited to environmental issues, is going to set stage for the enactment of a Public Participation Act. Because Kenya, in 2019, had a public participation bill. It failed. Again, last year, we have another public participation bill. It's in Parliament. First reading, no second reading, no third reading. Public participation. Because if you go by Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy as the rule of the people, by the people and for the people, you realize that the term people cuts across. And then the Constitution was a product of the people. So public participation is a conversation that you must have. Okay, they're finishing setting up. So our paper basically, I did it together with my lecturer, Mrs. Evelyn Mogera. And we wanted to assess public participation as a public voice. That is now our topic is climate justice through public voice, assessing Kenya's participatory approach to environmental governance. Recent happenings in Kenya, given by the Mohammed Ali Badi case, we have seen the Mwiko Basin case, we have seen a lot of jurisprudential underpinnings around public participation, but you're always having a problem on the effective implementation of public participation. Yes, let's go to the next slide, please. Next. Yeah, so I'm going to be very brief, 7 minutes it is. So our paper starts by underlining what's public participation, and then if we are talking public participation in environmental matters, then we have to understand the historical context of public participation. How did we get public participation? We start by drawing that public participation was an ancient practice, and then we draw reference to Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy. We go right into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then we come to the enactment of the Kyoto Protocol. Then we see, before the Kyoto Protocol, we had the UNFCCC. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol. We have the Aarhus Convention, which was discussed yesterday. You also have the Agenda 21, then we have the Bali Guidelines of the United Nations, and then there around between 1990 to 1999, we had the Environmental Management and Coordination Act. And surprisingly enough, in 1999, Kenya had already entrenched public participation in environmental matters. So that set stage on what was going to govern environmental issues. Then we dive into the legal framework, because if you try to assess the literature on public participation, there's very, very little information on the legal framework as a whole, that is governing public participation. Among the acts that we dissect in, we have talked about MCA, we have talked about the Climate Change Act that was enacted last year, and also in 2016, we have talked about the Energy Act and all other acts that entrench public participation. Suffice to say, the Constitution of Kenya, if you go and look at Chapter 5, that is Article 69 rather, we will see that public participation has been deeply reiterated in all issues, including the involvement of the community. And then under point number 3, we argue that public participation can enable climate justice. But then, for it to enable climate justice, it must be done within the procedural limits that have been set within the jurisprudential underpinnings that have been established in various cases, including the Mwiko Basin. Under this point, we go to the Oge case. I hope most of us are privy to it. The Oge case where they were evicted from the Mau forest. We try to question, why would then, if by then we had the Constitution of Kenya 2010, why would the government go ahead and evict the Oge people without seeking the prior and informed consent? As much as we know they are going to be evicted, but then why wouldn't it be done within the procedural limits that had been provided? So we try to question the government's brains behind the eviction, and then we argue that if the government had done it right, then we wouldn't be having what we see now as the Oge case, which up to now, the African Human People's Court judgment has not been implemented. Still, the Oge case is in a post-judgmental process, and we don't know. Maybe we hope that this discussion is going to lobby for further action. Next slide, please. And then, we cannot talk about public participation without talking about the role of the judiciary. Yesterday, Justice Oscar Angoche did dive deeply into the role of the judiciary, and I would want to talk more about it, but perhaps a reiteration. We have the ELC, the Environmental Land Court, which has been established under Article 162. You also see that we have the Environmental Land Court Act. So clearly, with the coming into place of the ELC, and then with the reiteration that public participation should be key in all decisions, as envisaged under Article 10, we don't really have a problem with the role of the judiciary. Now, the problem is the implementation challenges surrounding it. That brings me to the next point where we do a case analysis. We highlight about the Mwiko Basin case. We bring out issues surrounding the Mwiko Basin case, and we saw that one of the issues that arose, there was an argument by then the petitioner, which was the government, that, remember, at the onset of this project, we never saw, we didn't have county governments. But then Lamu County came into place. So what happens? The government bypasses it and saying that this has been overtaken by events. So we cannot have such an argument because this project is going to impact more the people on the ground, right? So we cannot bypass these people without entrenching their views, because they say if we bring various views together, we are going to have a better process. Under point number 6, we lay the challenges. One of the challenges we say, we don't have a public participation act. I've talked about it. The second challenge, we look at the bureaucratic hurdles, because if you go and look at the Information Act of 2013, I believe, there are a lot of hurdles on access to information. Then there's a vague definition of what amounts to national security, because you get that we want information to enable public participation, but then when you go to a government entity or government organ, they'll tell you, we cannot give you this information because it is a national security concern. So then we need to have conversations on that. We also look at the tokenism in public participation. Public participation being done as an abstract instead of following the due process. And then we give our recommendations. One of the recommendations, we call for intensive lobbying for the process of passing, of enacting rather, a Public Participation Act. We also call for the provision of a separate fund, because we are all products of public participation. So if you want public participation to be effectively fulfilled, then why don't you have a separate fund? I think time is now, because right from Article 1 of the Constitution, our Constitution is people-centered. So is human rights issues under Chapter 5 people-centered. So it's time to have a public participation fund to enable this process. So that was my presentation. I welcome further engagements. Thank you, Prof.
Perfect, thank you. That was also 8 minutes. Very good. And a lot of very, very good information there. The idea, I loved the word enabler. And this link with procedural. I'm not a lawyer, but the idea that participation can enable climate justice, that's an interesting one for our discussions, isn't it, as well? And the idea of procedural limits, these words don't really, I'm an ecologist, I don't really understand things like procedural limits, unless I'm working in the village, and then I know that when you hand over the stick, those are procedural limits. When you've got the stick, you talk, and when you don't talk. Okay, thank you very much for that, Kanani. And now, with an adjustment to the schedule, and by the way, when you are preparing and you've got PowerPoints, would you be kind enough, please, to send those PowerPoints to the email that begins with FOLAP, the one that is in the documentation that we got, so that then people can prepare to get the PowerPoints uploaded. In a change of schedule, we're moving to the later session, which is Susan Okoya and Scott Jones, which is, I don't know how I can be a discussant on my own paper, but there you go. And then we're going to hear from, after that, we're moving to this afternoon's session, and we're going to hear from John Jacinda and Joan Mdoze, the role of youth in climate change, and then after that we're going to hear from Ronald Kihali from Margins to Mainstream. So we're jigging around in the program a bit to try and get things a bit more coherent, to accommodate people who are coming from Cameroon and things like that. So thank you for your patience with all of that. So, Sue, are you ready?
Good morning. I would like to acknowledge Professor Scott, whom he has already said that he was my co-author in this. Our topic was on gendered aspects of environmental justice in municipal solid waste management, and our case study was in Nakuru Dam Site, Kenya. So this discussion is about justice. Justice in several forms, like environmental justice, climate justice, and also justice for the people who are living and working at the dam sites. With particular interest to the women, children, and girls who are also living and working at the dam site. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is the next slide. Thank you. So, this case of Nakuru dam site, which Professor Patricia yesterday mentioned about a deliberate contamination of some areas in the country, like which she gave a term called, which was that term? It was sacrifice zones. So I took Nakuru dam site, which is Egerton, as a sacrifice zone, because a lot is going on there. All the waste from Nakuru County ends up in this dam site, where we have children and women scavenge to eke a living from the same dam site. So we are asking ourselves how these women and children found themselves working or living in that dam site. And first, it starts with us. Justice starts with us. In brief, I will say that we are the consumers and we are the main producers and consumers of largely what ends up here at the dam site, which leads to this vulnerable group of people having to scavenge and work on this dump site to eco-living. So these girls and women mostly arrived here because they were evicted from their homes. Some came here because of sexual violence, and others fake promises, and others drugged. Several conditions made them, not by will, but several conditions pushed them to be in such conditions. To make the matters worse is what we found out, that even children who were born unplanned, and most even as a result of sexual violence, ended up being with their mothers, working in the same conditions. So the justice we are talking about here is the environmental justice pictured here. What justice are we doing to the environment? You can see how the waste is not well managed. There's no sorting. It's a lot of medical waste, together with even waste from our household, extra food that people cannot sustain, and they use what they think. They use what they think is good for them, but end up here because there's a mismanagement right from our homes. So the second level of justice under the environmental is what happens to these children who are being exposed to such environment. You can imagine the effects that it has to the children. That is all they know right from birth. That is what they have been exposed to. That is what they see their mothers do, and that is what they learn even as they grow, that is what life is all about. So where is justice for these children? Where is the legal access for them to know that that is not the kind of life that even me, I would wish to pass through, or either of our offsprings? So another set of justice is the climate change. A lot has been said about climate change, so I will pass through that. And even the erratic rainfall patterns that have been experienced in Nakuru County, for example. All the water from the west dump site, which is located at a hill, at a higher elevation in Nakuru town. You can imagine when it rains, all that water is washed down, and it seeps through the water and right into the people who are using it at the lower levels of the town. So and even the situation gets worse when when the rains continue for a long period, because how will they work in such conditions when the environment there becomes very murky? It becomes even very difficult for them to find some food, and they eke a livelihood from recycling and reusing some of the products that are considered as waste by us. Yes, so my discussion is not just about what is happening there, but I would like to end this with not only the description of everything that is happening at the dump site, which is also a picture of what is happening in very many other places, like even the Nairobi Dandora dump site and then other places in the world. But it's a call to action that these people living here truly and truly need justice. They don't know how to access it. Yes, they know that they are facing an injustice, but how? How are they going to access? How are they going to access the health justice that they should be? How are they going to access these cares like support from religious institutions, volunteers who are doing some work to try and help them? Do they have the social support? Do they have the medical care that most of us are privileged to have? So that is one thing that I think we should try and call for action. So there has been a lot that has been said by the Environmental Acts and Waste Management Acts, right from the national government to the county governments, but the problem comes to the implementation. Are they really being implemented? Are the waste management, are the waste being managed in the process that they should be managed? So such questions should come up. Next slide, the last slide. Yes, so we were looking at the practices and some of the actions that we as individuals can start. We all know of the refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and repurpose. So I would like to dwell on the rethink, that you should rethink and challenge the already existing approaches of us using products, and also the behaviors that lead to a lot of unmanaged waste products ending up at the dump. So it starts with us, and we should start acting from our own individual levels. I think with that, and also, I forgot to mention the practice. Already the access, I've talked about the access, about yes, they know that they're experiencing these injustices, but how do they access the justice that they deserve? And then building capacity for community-based organization is also another approach that we should go and put more effort in trying to bring them together as a community, trying to look for other alternative methods of green, maybe entrepreneurial management systems of the solid waste, and then also gendered focused alternatives where we should try and fix that notion of people, of what women and men should do. For example, encourage those children who are facing that injustice of having to look at what they're sustaining themselves from the dump site. We can encourage them and try to fix other technical appropriate measures that can be used instead of just simply closing down the dump site, which is not a solution. The people living there use that as a source of livelihood. Thank you.
I like the idea of not having an ABC, but having an ABG, and bringing gender into this. Susan, thank you very much. And I liked also the way you finished on the word rethink, which was an echo of Shem's talk at the start, where he said we have to do some rethinking. And some of what Susan was talking about there is our individual and collective responsibilities require a rethink. And it's very difficult stories to listen to. Just a word of the slide that was up there for quite a while, though there were 7 people that Susan and I interviewed, well, we interviewed 52 actually, but of the 7 that tried to stand up and tell their stories, 5 could not complete because they broke down in tears. They just couldn't tell their stories. They wanted to, but they couldn't complete it. It's some of the worst and most harrowing tales. If you multiply that by all the dump sites across Kenya and the world, it's a tough story relating to environmental justice, human justice, and access. Great stuff. Thank you very much, Sue. And we will weave that into a discussion. Now, who's next? It is, sorry, I've got to turn a page here. This is John and Joan. John, you're very welcome. The role of youth in climate change mitigation and adaptation in Kenya.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, this paper, the role of the youth in climate change mitigation and adaptation in Kenya, it was done by 2 writers. That was John Jakinda and Joan Bonze. So I'm John, and my co-author is online. So in the interest of time, I like to begin. So what informed this study is the international saying that children are the future and youth are the present. In light of that, if you look at according to the United Nations reports on United Nations environmental reports, it says that 70% of Africans are in their youthful population. That means from the ages of 18 to 35. So before I move to the slides, I'd like to just highlight some things in regards to if you look at the 2030 agenda on sustainable development, it asserts that one of the goals of promoting the rights of the youth in regards to climate change, it advocates by protecting the well-being of both the present and the future generations. Okay. There was a video I wanted to play, but I'll just continue in the interest of time. So, okay, there it is. Okay, I'll move to climate change and intergenerational equity. Now, in this principle, it was mentioned by Professor Ogada yesterday, and it touches on the aspects that intergenerational equity, it views the human community as a partnership among all generations, and this simply implies that in the context of the principle of sustainable development, the younger populations, they are normally, they are the ones who are going to be affected by the adverse effects of climate change in future. And this principle is reaffirmed further by the principle of, in the Paris agreements, which advocates for this principle, since if we don't protect our climate in these present times, then it means the future generations will be the ones to bear the brunt. The next slide. Okay, next one. Okay, there are some cases I highlighted. One of them is the case of future generations versus the Ministry of Environment and others. In this case, it touched on the Amazon forest, which is based in South America. In this particular case, the 25 youth plaintiffs filed a constitutional petition challenging the several corporations which were violating human rights through the emissions that were being produced. And you can see the court, in arriving at its decision, it emphasized and reaffirmed that there is a substantial link that exists on the right to life, health, and human dignity. And this right and the right to a healthy environment being intertwined. And in its conclusion, it stated that the government needs to put measures to protect the Amazon forest. And in that particular case, even though the forest is majorly in Brazil, but you can see that it's the youth from Colombia who are the ones who brought the case before the court. Another case is the case of HELD versus the state of Montana. In this particular case, 16 young youth activists, they filed a constitutional climate lawsuits against their state government, arguing that the Montana was violating their constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment. And Professor Pielo in the morning stated that the fossil fuels are one of the major drives that leads to the protracted crisis in regards to climate change. And in this particular case, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, arguing that the state agency were violating their constitutional right, because if they continue to advocate for the funding of the fossil fuel development, then it means it will affect the environment even to the future generation. Okay. Human rights, this one I won't belabor because majority of people have spoken about it, but I'll put my emphasis on the Human Rights Committee general comment on the right to life. In this particular comment, it emphasized that environmental degradation and climate change are intertwined in the sense that states have the obligation to protect, promote, and respect to preserve the environment, because the right to clean and healthy environment can be intertwined to the right to life. And the next slide. Okay, I'll move the recommendations, then I'll play a small video so that you can see what I'm driving at. Now, the first recommendation I saw is transgenerational knowledge transfer and the adaptation of sustainable practices. This one, it can be argued in the sense that when the youths are empowered in matters climate change, they are the ones who will be the ones to mentor the future generations who are children. And in regards to the education and outreach, with proper education and skills, like in inculcating curriculums of environment from primary schools, then this one will be able to mentor children from the small age so that they can be able to continue. The next slide. Then there's the local community development. When we empower youth, majority of the youths are majorly based on slums. So if they are engage in projects that promote sustainable, which are aimed at promoting sustainable development, then it will be able to enhance quality of life while preserving also natural resources. There's one video I wanted to play. Don't know if it can be able to. Three. Yes. Okay, there is a technical hitch, but in regards to this, there were youths in Mukuru, which is one of the largest slums in Nairobi. They were doing something known as BSS farming. In this particular context, they were using the black soldier bees they were collecting those bees, and then they employed some strategies. So they looked for young people. They were collecting wastes from various corners, and then after collecting the wastes from the dump sites, which normally when the floods happens, there's normally a challenge because the drainage systems they have problems. So in regards to this, when the bees are collected, then they are able to consume the wastes, and the products that they produce afterwards, it's used to generate larvae, which is used as a biomass when they are consumed, and it's used to make fertilizer and animal feeds, which they sell for the purposes of generating income, because you can understand that in this era, majority of youths are facing unemployment. So these black soldier flies, they are the ones which they employed this method, and the Global Center on Adaptation provided an additional of 12 units to boost their efforts in regards to, for their work to be effective and for them to be able to advocate for mitigate climate change and to adopt practices that can be able to sustain them so that it can sustain the future generations. I think I'm through. I thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. It's quite emotional, this, isn't it? I mean, we're using our brains all the time to sort of analyze law and do all of this stuff and thinking, but actually, some of this stuff is in our spirit and in our hearts as well. There's quite a lot of emotional content here, thinking about the next generation and thinking about the state of people's lives with waste management and stuff. It's a slightly different presentation than just laws. John, thank you so much for that, and for also talking about transgenerational knowledge and equity. And I liked the turn of phrase, partnership amongst all generations, indicating that knowledge can go up as well. I'm always amazed at how much I'm learning from the people who are younger than me, not just giving my wonderful knowledge to them, but waiting to hear what their views are, because young people are seeing the world in a very different way, and it's good to learn from them. Okay, least but not last. Oh, sorry, Ronald. Last but not least, Ronald Kihali. That was a joke, by the way, Ronald. Please, don't take it you can take it personally, but not too personally. You're bringing up the rear here, Ronald. Ronald is going to talk about margins to mainstream inclusion in climate financing mechanisms. Are you good to go?
Good afternoon. I'm Ronald Kihali, and today I'll be speaking on a very controversial but important issue titled From Margins to Mainstream. LGBTQIA plus inclusion in climate financing mechanisms. So this is something that I consider a really important human rights issue, and I felt it was important to talk about it because it is highly underexplored, and I have not heard anyone talk about it, so here we go. If you could just slightly proceed to slide number 4, just slide number 4. So I've skipped some slides because of time. Let me just quickly begin by looking at the nexus between climate change, environmental justice, and LGBTQI plus rights. For those who don't know the meaning of the acronym, it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, stroke questioning, intersexual, asexual, and other identities which are not in the part of the bracket. There are so many, by the way. So, of course, the root of this discrimination in climate injustice is because of the fact that LGBTI communities already face discrimination because of homophobia, homophobic laws. Just to give an example of Kenya, we do not recognize LGBTQI rights, although the Supreme Court last year held that LGBTQI organizations are allowed to be registered. So quickly proceeding to the nexus, if you look at the third point, this is a report that was done by Amnesty International, and Amnesty International outlined a report showing that globally LGBTQI communities face homelessness, and they are 120% more likely to face homelessness than their heterosexual counterparts. And this is because of family rejection. A lot of families, especially in conservative areas, are very religious, and they wouldn't want to associate themselves even with their own children who are part of this community. Another reason for that high percentage is discrimination in housing, whereby because of the homophobic laws and policies, a lot of these communities cannot access housing, and even if they do access housing, most of them are evicted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And because of these evictions and because of this discrimination in housing and family rejection, they become very vulnerable to climate crisis. So for instance, if there are floods or there are hurricanes, it is very unlikely for these communities who are displaced or who are homeless to find access to protective shelter during the crisis. And so you can see this whole concept is about bringing the concept of intersectional climate vulnerability among the LGBTQI communities. And another example is in Mozambique during the tropical cyclone Eloise, where also a lot of LGBTQI plus communities who were homeless were displaced and found it very difficult for them to access permanent, safe shelters. And you could just, well, the same problem was also experienced in the United States in Hurricane Katrina, where there was an equal distribution of aid. And this unequal distribution of emergency aid, again, is simply because of their discrimination, simply because of who they are. And they are not given the same priority as their heterosexual counterparts. If you could just move to the next slide. Just a final case study of Kenya, where I talk about the Kakuma refugee camp, which is a real problem. And here I talk about climate-induced and displaced LGBT migrants. So these are migrants who are coming to the Kakuma refugee camp because of displacement, and this displacement is caused by the climate crisis. So, for example, let's say there are floods or there's a hurricane, and these communities are displaced, and they move to another country to seek refuge or to seek shelter. But the problem is that when they move to these other countries, these host countries, most of them are usually homophobic. Think of South Africa and Uganda. South Africa is very progressive to LGBT rights. But when they are displaced from South Africa because of the climate crisis and they decide to move to Uganda, which is a bit more secure in terms of the climate crisis, when they get there, they find that they are not afforded the same legal protections as they were afforded in South Africa. And so those host countries become a big problem for these LGBTQI communities who have moved there to access refuge. And you'd also realize that 83% of them who go to these camps who have been displaced as a result of the climate crisis, they suffer physical assault through torture, rape, and this rape includes corrective rape. For those who don't know corrective rape, this is where, for example, I'll give an example of the lesbians in the LGBTQI community. Most of them face corrective rape, whereby they are raped by heterosexual men because they believe that if they rape them, then they can turn them back to straight women. Then there's also the issue of murdered, and then 88% are also denied police assistance. And this was also a report that was done by Outright International. Outright International is an international non-governmental organization within the United Nations system that specifically focuses on advancing LGBT rights globally. Again, another issue is also the aspect of refugee status determination and identification for these LGBT communities who have been displaced as a result of the climate crisis. Most of them do not get access to this status determination and identification simply because the host countries into which they have migrated do not recognize their rights. So this is where I bring the concept of double vulnerability, whereby they are being discriminated as climate refugees, where they have essentially been displaced into, but also as members of a marginalized group, because they can't get the same emergency aid as their heterosexual counterparts. And then I have so many other examples. Because of time, I may not get into them. Then if you just proceed to the next slide, where I look at climate, I do a queer-lensed analysis because of the problem with regards to inadequate access to finance for the LGBTQI communities. I do a queer-lensed analysis of climate financing mechanisms, where quickly, I'll just go through this very fast, slide 7. I analyze frameworks such as the Paris Agreement, the Climate Change Act, and the SDGs, and you'll realize that most of them are queer-blind. They have a broad approach to vulnerability, but they rarely include LGBTI communities as a vulnerable group. But these are groups which are significantly affected by the climate crisis. How many minutes do I have? 2 minutes, perfect. So, yes, you could just proceed to the next slide. I also do a queer evaluation of climate funds, the Adaptation Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, Green Climate Fund, and the Loss and Damage Fund also have the same issues. And I simply outline that there's a need to address the full spectrum of vulnerability caused by climate change, because all of these frameworks are more or less queer-blind. By queer-blind, I mean they're not sensitive to the rights of the LGBTQI communities who are displaced. If you could just quickly move to slide 9, which addresses the challenges in LGBTQI inclusion. Some of them I've already talked about, like the Kakuma case and everything. Another issue quickly is the tension between developed and developing countries on LGBTI rights, because most developing countries do not recognize LGBTI rights. But contrastingly, most developed nations do recognize, but now it becomes a problem for them to provide financial aid to developing countries because most of them do not recognize their rights. Then if you just quickly proceed to the recommendations. I can't touch on best practices right now. I can share that later. Just proceed to the next. So my recommendations, I have a number of strategic approaches. I think it's important to have intersectional lens by state that is quite inclusive of marginalized communities such as LGBTQI+ communities. I think targeted inclusion is also very important. We need to specifically have these frameworks, the climate finance frameworks that I've just talked about. They should specifically target LGBTI communities as a vulnerable group, because right now most of them have broad approaches to vulnerability. Yes, integration into existing frameworks in terms of vulnerability assessments, finding criteria, project evaluation and monitoring, so that these communities are actually able to access those funds. Of course, strategic partnership with LGBT organizations is important, because it's from these LGBT organizations that you can get to understand the needs of these communities, and so that you can tailor your support to capture their needs. If you could just quickly move to the next slide. In the previous slide, I've also talked about inclusive leadership, very important. It's important to have members of the LGBT community as part of this advisory boards, committees, which deal with these climate change issues, so that they can be able to develop queer-sensitive laws that specifically target the LGBT community. And just to finish, of course, public awareness is very important. This is currently being done by civil society, and I think this has been very important. We've seen the Supreme Court in 2023 allowing LGBT organizations to register. And then, of course, international collaborations is also very important. The aspect of mutual respect for DI. DI specifically stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's very important. It's fundamental for us to ensure that climate action is just, it's equitable, and it's inclusive. And if you just proceed to the final slide, Yes, my conclusion is that this is an aspect of an intersectional climate vulnerability among LGBTI communities, a critical human rights issue, and there's a need to advance global citizenship. In your own time, you can look for the meaning of global citizenship. It's an important aspect in climate resilience through inclusive, just, and equitable climate action to ensure sustainable development so that no one is left behind in the fight against climate change. Thank you so much, and I look forward to further engagements on this issue.
Brilliant. Well done, Ronald. And thank you for tolerating the pressure of time. Really appreciate it, and the interaction between us. That was super cool. Once again, we're coming up with notions of participation and respect and how we work with those things. And a fantastic presentation, a brave presentation, dealing with an issue that we don't get to hear much about. So that's good for all of us to hear what that might mean and how we feel about that. Again, you know, a marginalized community that's dealing with its marginalization, but when climate change happens, what happens to them is a bit different than what happens to the rest of us. Okay, in an ever-changing program, we are now going to have a talk on effectiveness of institutional and legal water policies in Rwanda and Kenya in promoting women's participation in water governance. And I invite Zipporah to give us that talk. And then I'm not quite sure. Ruth, after that, are we going to have a little discussion? Because there's 6 papers to discuss here. We need a little bit of time to discuss. We can't. So we need to recover a little bit of time. If we can maybe have a slightly shorter lunch break and do 45 minutes for lunch break, that should get us largely back on track if Gudrun and I manage to be miserable police officers and get things going. I'm so sorry about this, but we do need to recover the time that was lost earlier. And Zipporah was only told about 4 minutes ago that she was about to present, so please excuse the small thing. I have to say that any one of these presentations that we've so far heard deserves a really good discussion. They've all been absolutely superb, and these are all students who are presenting, and for many of them it's their first ever conference presentation. It's a fantastic thing that they're doing, and they're under extra pressure because they've got me bullying them for 7 or 8 minutes. So you know, really, when time comes and we give a round of applause to all these presentations, please bear that in mind as well. These guys are doing a great job. This is nobody's fault, the short delay, because Zipporah was not expecting to speak. I'm going to wait until the chairs have finished squeaking. Welcome, Zipporah.
Good afternoon. My name is Zipporah Nyokabi Mureithi. I'm a student from the Department of Natural Resource Management at Egerton University. I'm here to share my insights on evaluating the effectiveness of institutional and legal water policies in Rwanda and Kenya in promoting women participation in water governance and conflict resolution. Water is both a cause and a tool for conflicts. The conflicts associated with water are conflicts over water use, distribution, availability, and these conflicts are further exacerbated by issues of resource degradation, resource scarcity, overexploitation, overconsumption, and unsustainable consumption patterns. The effect of these water conflicts impact women directly as they are the primary water users. They are disproportionately affected by the impact of these water-associated tensions and conflicts. Like like everywhere around the world, in Africa, in many parts of, in many countries, such as Rwanda, such as Kenya, women share a set of gender-based disadvantages. By this, I mean limited access to water resources, land resources, agricultural inputs, mainly because of the existing androcentric system, structural inequalities, and this vulnerability underscores the need for understanding how the existing structural frameworks that have been set by our governments either impede or promote their participation in water governance at local scales. For this study, the research methodology, the study area, it was carried out in a place called Mukunguri Wetland in Rwanda, and also in Nyando Wetland in Kenya. Also, the research design that was employed was a cross-sectional research design that allowed for comparisons between the two countries. And then the framework for assessment was the OECD Water Governance Indicator tool. This tool is a tool that is used to assess how institutions, how instruments are performing at local scales. For the research methodology, this study was purely women-specific, and I was focusing on women in water resource users associations, both in Rwanda and in Kenya. This is just a pictorial overview. The Water Resource Users Association in Rwanda, it has a long name, but I'll call it as TMW, and then for Kenyan is Nyando Water Users Association, is NW. These are just some of the ongoing discussions, mainly focus group discussions that were taking place. For the results and discussions, one, there exist very big disparities between RUAs in level of policy enforcement. You'll find RUAs in Rwanda are very strong in enforcing women participation in water governance at grassroots level. Also, there exist disparities in implementation and effectiveness, with Rwanda in the positive lead in terms of enforcement mechanisms, while Nyando is following way behind. In terms of rate of women involvement in decision-making processes, both countries had a relatively high rate of participation, mainly because of the gender quota systems that both governments have put in place, and results, most women were actually being involved in decision-making processes, in the RUA committees, in the RUA projects. Also, we set to test if there are any significant relationships, patterns that either influence how women participate in these water decision-making processes at local scales. And then there was significant associations between the policies set by local authorities and the clarity and effectiveness. For the conclusion, yes, there is significant progress that has been made in the implementation of these policies, but there are still gaps that are still there. There are still loops that are still there. However, Rwanda is still in the positive lead. For both Water Resource Users Association, there are still inconsistencies in policy implementation. And then, and this limits the participation of women in water governance. And then for both water resource users associations, they are overly reliant on government and donor aid, and this makes them lack the capacity to fully implement gender-sensitive policies and projects. For the conclusion, significant progress has been made in the implementation of policies that promote women's participation in water governance, with Rwanda in the positive lead. For both RUAs in this case, I mean community-led water governance structures. There are still inconsistency in policy implementation, and for both RUAs, there is need to make them self-sufficient, so for them to stop relying on government projects and donor aid funding. For the recommendations, there is need for continuous monitoring and surveillance of the institutional and legal water policy frameworks at local scales to enable assessing the impacts of these policies on women. The RUAs should develop self-sufficiency mechanisms, for example, income generating activities that enable them to be independent and run projects effectively. And then I'd love to acknowledge the Nile Basin Capacity Building Network Foundation through the Nile Basin Student Exchange Project that facilitated this research. And I'd love to leave you with my final quote, which is, climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. This is a famous quote that was said by Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland. Thank you.
That was great. And Zipporah, thanks again for adjusting so quickly and giving such a tight and very useful paired case study. Good data, good information. That was a really superb presentation. I've been taking quite a deep dive into the feminist literature on conflict management. I haven't been into the feminist literature for about 10 or 15 years, and I am finding so much really good concrete analysis about emotionality, cognition, ways in which women and men might negotiate or do things differently. The standard of scholarship has gone way beyond the political movement of feminism and any prejudices you might have from 20 years ago about the feminist movement as a political force to a sort of more academically robust and analytical set of literature. And I would urge anybody to take seriously what Zipporah ended with about looking at feminist solutions in the feminist literature in regard to critical thinking and other things. Fantastic. We are, I'm not even going to mention the T word again, it's becoming too rude. We have 6 presentations, all of which deserve 10 minutes or more, but we only have 10 minutes for all of them. I just want to pick out a couple of things. This idea of rethinking, what can we do there with regard to justice and access to justice. I'd like to pick up on voices mattering and having meaning, which Shem mentioned. This notion of democracy that Kanani mentioned and procedural limits, but the words being an enabler of climate justice. Sue gave us some very difficult stories in a very tight presentation. Also talking about implementation. So a question that just came up at the last one was about inconsistencies of policy implementation that Zipporah was mentioning. What is the role of justice and access to justice on the implementation side, or is that when the law disappears and it's a policing matter? I don't know about that, but implementation has come up quite a lot. Notions of equity and rights. Fantastic little video which we couldn't hear, but this idea of turning waste to wealth, a very creative solution that John highlighted for us, the idea that we might not just be looking at legal mechanisms, but we might be looking at legal support for community mechanisms. How might that work? Thanks to John for that. Ronald, you also had some very specific recommendations in your very fantastic presentation about how marginalized groups experience other consequences than mainstream groups when climate change impacts bite. And you also mentioned notions of participation and how marginalized groups should be enabled to participate. Thank you, John, for that. And Zipporah, I've just mentioned about the idea for implementation. You also finished on the idea of self-sufficiency, which I think is something that Gilbert will be mentioning a little bit later when it comes to how communities can respond to the climate crisis when they feel at distance from, or a disconnect from central government, and maybe even a disconnect from the legal system. So notions of disconnect there. Right, 3 questions, 10 minutes. Okay, Ruth.
Okay. John, thank you for the presentation, but I just want, it's not really a question, but I want you to also integrate Kenyan case law on intergenerational equity. And remember Justice Angote was here yesterday? And I can give you one example, John Mudui and 9 others. You heard the story of River Tiva in Kitui. You need to look into that. Huh? Maybe we can come and I'll give you the details. Don't only quote the international cases. Kenyans also want to learn from your paper. Thank you.
Okay, it doesn't count as a question. It was a comment. Okay, first 2.
My question is to Nyokabi. Please break down how climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. I never understood that quote.
Okay, next question, Gudrun.
Thank you. I have a very short question to Sue, who showed us the women's suffering at the dump sites. Is there any kind of measures? Are there NGOs active in this field? What can be done to improve the situation, or what has been done so far to address this situation? Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Gudrun. 2 nice short questions. Time for one more. Yes.
Good afternoon, and let me introduce myself because I haven't been here. I wasn't here yesterday. My name is Christine Agimba, and I'm from the Kenya Law Reform Commission. I was interested in the presentation on public participation with regard to environmental justice, and I think it's very useful to have a deep dive into that issue. But in doing so, as we reflect on how access to information is important in public participation, the speakers perhaps should also ask themselves why the state is struggling to try and conceptualize what public participation is and to come up with clear policies and standards around this. Because if that is not clear, what then are we adopting when we are talking about public participation in environmental justice or environmental matters? Just a question. I think you know there have been like 3 draft bills. There's one current one going on. While there exists a sessional paper on public participation policy, we are still struggling. And I think you can see that even from the judgments that come out of the judiciary.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. Lokabi first. What was the question to? Who was that question to? Lokabi. Did you get the question?
Thank you, Anita. For the quote, climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. In this case, I'm looking at it from the gender lens. And here I mean for us to address the issue of climate injustice, we need to incorporate issues of gender equality, gender access, improve on our sustainability measures, and also tap into the indigenous knowledge of women who are mainly dependent on these natural resources to meet their livelihoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Zipporah. And Sue, are there any NGOs working?
Thank you, Prof. Zagel, for that question. I would say that there are already measures in place. The only difficulty that we have, the only challenge that is at the ground is the amount of support and implementation happening is very limited. It's not enough, and the population is growing there it's growing very fast. So the implementation part is what is the problem. And if there are very limited NGOs, and mostly are community-based and individuals who are trying to help out at a very grassroots level. So the implication is very minimal. Thank you.
No formal NGOs, just community voluntary effort in a way. Okay, thank you very much. And for everybody, I think Christine asked the question, why is the state struggling with this notion of participation despite 3 draft bills going forward? Participation, we can talk about that a little bit. You're making me run up and down. I just got back to the front and you bring me all the way back here. Nice and brief.
Okay, so I think if I understood your question well, is why the state is struggling to conceptualize on what public participation is. I think if we go back to the Mulko Basin case, the background of that judgment, the principles that were adopted in the Mulko Basin case came from a South African case called the Doctors for Life International vs. Speak of the National Assembly. And then just the other day, there was a case, the National Assembly, an appeal versus Okiya Mtata case. They were contradictory in nature because, you see, in Okiya Mtata, the court did state that, the Court of Appeal did state that in the collection of public views, we should, the public entity should be able to give reasons why it has rejected some views. But then, if you look all along from the Mulko Basin, the jurisprudence around it. Now, that being said, what's the problem? The state is not struggling. I don't think so. It's because we don't want to. Take, for instance, the impeachment of Rigathi Gachagua. Though political, they did it in less than 5 hours, right? So if they really wanted, because we have the brains, we have the people who can do that. So if the state would have wanted to enact a public participation framework, we could see, we already have a session paper, it's good you have mentioned it. I also went through the parliamentary draft on public participation. It provides clear frameworks on what's public participation, but they never follow it. So the problem, it might even be the state itself. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you. These vertical connections between what happens in community and what happens in the state level, notions of political will, I think, go well beyond Kenya and affect my country too with regard to climate change. But more of that tomorrow. In the meantime, Gilbert, you've got some reflections briefly.
Thank you. I just wanted to maybe add a voice to Zipporah's presentation in the fact that what is being implemented in Rwanda and the water resource use associations is a complete copy of the Kenyan policy and regulatory environment. So if you look at that and see that Rwanda is doing much better than us, yet what they're implementing was copy-pasted from us. So we have the best law. The problem is implementation. Number 2 is on waste management. I think we are looking at a face value of waste management, but waste management in Kenya is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the actors are hidden behind some veils, and you will never see them. And the interests are largely economic, to a very small scale social, and also to a large scale political. So you need to, Sue, you will need to look at this through that lens as well, and see who are the bigger boys in this thing.
Thank you. Yes, some really interesting presentation. We have to stop, I'm afraid. Okay. Very, very briefly.
Ma'am, you asked a very good question on public participation. My view is on environmental issues, we should be careful not to combine together public participation on political sphere and on the environment. For example, look at New Zealand and Canada. They have now empowered the indigenous communities, especially on how the environment is. For example, there was a pipeline, for example, I don't know, the US, where a pipeline was to be constructed, and the indigenous community refused. And the government said, okay, you refused, we won't do it. So the threshold for public engagement on environmental issues is much higher than on the public, or on this political sphere. And another thing I'd like to say, for example, in Kenya, public participation on environmental issues precedes the 2010 Constitution. We have even the 1996 case where the government was stopped from translocating the antelopes and even gazetting of national reserves without community engagement. So we should be very careful not to make environmental engagement, community engagement on environmental issues, mix it with this political sphere. Because on environmental issues, it's much deeper because of one reason. The environment, the nature belongs to the community.
Thank you very much. That separation is very useful. I'm not sure that everybody would agree with you about the word belong, that nature belongs to the community. I think that itself is a philosophical as well as another sort of discussion. Brilliant. I mean, there's just so much to say here. We could go on for a very long time. I encourage you to pick up informally, speak to the speakers, ask them questions. Yeah, I mean, I've got a million things that I would love to say, but I'm going to back off because, yeah, talk to me afterwards. Thank you so much. Please, could we have a really fantastic, and I'm talking fantastic, very, very loud round of applause for 6 excellent presentations. And thank you for your patience with me as I bullied people through 7 minutes. I'm going to hand on to the next police officer now.
Thank you very much, Scott. So I have the honor to present 5 papers. One from yesterday. So Caroline Shilaho from University of Nairobi. She will speak about the disparities in land rights and the effect of climate adaptation and mitigation measures in Kenya. Please, Caroline, you have 7 minutes. And I feel bad because yesterday I talked so long, so but I have to police that. Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, so basically what the topic is all about is, what the article is about, is how does the lack of land tenure, the security of land tenure affect climate change, adaptation and mitigation measures and vice versa. So essentially what I have looked at, the main points which I have put together is what is that link between land rights, tenure and climate change. And what we have to bear in mind is that this is not a conversation that is common. This is a conversation that is growing. There has been generally a lack of linking between land rights and tenure and climate change. But it is a growing conversation. And the first one to address this has been the voluntary guidelines voluntary guidelines under the World Food Organization, which has specifically linked land rights or land tenure with climate change. As was indicated by the speakers yesterday, there is definitely a link between land tenure and climate change. So I'll just summarize that because of the land tenure rights basically affect or impact on climate change and environment in the sense that it impacts on the land use. What people use the land for and what they don't use the land for definitely affects climate change. People who are secure in their land rights are able to use the land well, basically look at long-term measures such as growing of trees, while those who have insecure land rights are likely to make short-term gains. They look for short-term gains, and therefore they end up cutting down trees and unsafe agricultural practices, which then impact on climate change. Now, the other aspect I would like to bring in with respect to the land tenure is that, and one of the speakers has talked about it, like the eviction of the Ogiek community, on the basis that they do not have those secure land rights. So it impacts in that they can be evicted at any time, and then you do find that even in accessing justice, there's a difficulty in accessing environmental justice where the climate change has impacted. They've lost dwellings, their houses, they've lost their crops, because most courts would want you to have the locus. Who are you to be able to sue? So if you're not the owner of the land, then definitely you are at a disadvantaged position to be able to seek compensation. And so the land tenure, the land rights impact on that justice that they would have sought. Okay, so then the next aspect that I'm just being brief so that I move through it quickly. The other aspect is the fragmentation of the laws and policies in Kenya with respect to climate change and land rights. Okay, so when you look at the Climate Change Act, for instance, now the Climate Change Act sets up the Climate Change Council, which is chaired by the President, and it is supposed to spearhead climate change issues. If you look at the members, the members are the Cabinet Minister for Environment, then it has the Cabinet Minister for Energy, and then a person from the Treasury. Now, there's nobody from the Ministry of Lands. And yet we can see that the linkage between land and climate change is actually very crucial when you're dealing with forests, when you're dealing with who is allocated land, who is not allocated land. This is crucial, and yet the Climate Change Act does not include the Lands Minister as a part of the Climate Change Council. So even when you look at the Climate Change Action Plan, which was 2018 to 2022, and the National Adaptation Plan 2015 to 2030, it is spearheaded mainly by the Environment Minister. The Lands Minister does not come anywhere in this plan. And I looked at the team that even took part in these discussions, and there was nobody from the Lands Ministry. So you can see that there's this fragmented approach towards climate change issues, because land is at the center of this. You cannot deal with pollution. You cannot deal with deforestation without first addressing who owns that land and who has rights with respect to that land. So then lastly on that is that the lack of course, tenure rights impacts on who has discussions with respect to climate change. So as you'll find that in most cases, it's the landowners, those with titles who are invited to the table to make these discussions. And yet you find that most of this land is not necessarily occupied by those who have titles or who have secure land rights. You have the squatters, you have those who have rented this particular land, and these are the people managing. They are the people who are either cutting down trees, they are the people who are practicing safe agricultural practices. And so if you leave out this lot on the basis that they lack those secure land rights, then definitely there is an issue with then achieving the actual impact mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate change. So the recommendations include harmonizing. First of all, harmonizing our laws and policies so that all the ministries, all those who have to actually be on the forefront of dealing with climate change, especially the land ministry, is actually, there's a harmonization of all those sectors with the one of environment and the other ministries. And then, of course, there has to be a conversation with those who own land, who have secure land rights, and inclusive of those who do not own, such as women, pastoralists, indigenous communities, because despite lacking the formal land rights, they do play a large role when it comes to how they use land and how this affects climate change. And then, of course, I think I've been shown the time, so I'm a bit, the other recommendations, I think now has flown out of my head. So basically, it's that communication, basically dealing with this and then ensuring that those who do not have secure land rights actually get land rights, and then ensuring that those who do not, there's a recognition that despite not having land rights, they have a role to play in respect to climate change, okay? So I think that is what I would say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for this insight and showing us the links between land use and climate change, looking at the different interests, but also at the legal framework. So the next presentations will be on the topic of mainstreaming gender in climate and environmental justice. And the first speaker will be Collins Odundo from Moi University School of Law. The topic will be gender dimension of climate change. Collins? Oh, okay, please.
Good afternoon. I think it is afternoon. So I don't think they have my slides, so I think I'm just going to do the presentation. My presentation is on the gender dimensions of climate change, into quotes, feminist climate renaissance. So at the onset, it is very important to understand what we mean by a feminist climate renaissance. This term is borrowed from the workings of Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson, who argue that this is the idea that focuses on the idea that women are well placed to lead the climate crisis response. So this is why gender becomes important. Because the paper that I'm working on examines how women are affected by disruptive climatic events and presents the argument for the inclusion of gender perspectives in resilience building initiatives, since gender and gender issues are central to the fight against climate change, because tackling social economic vices that create vulnerability should be addressed. But the paper goes further, not only to look at gender and women within that setup of gender, but it goes on to see women not only as victims, because I think most of the presentations that we've seen today, they place women at the center of victimhood as victims of climate change. What I want to look at basically is women not only as victims, but as solution builders in this process, so that we do not remove from them the agency. Because when we look at women simply as victims of climate change, what we do is remove their personal agency from the process. And it creates a poor understanding of climate justice, and it ignores their contributions to the process. So basically the paper departs from traditional approaches of conceptualizing climate solutions and embracing women's agency in the climate crisis responses. So the first thing that the paper tries to do is to make a connection between gender and vulnerabilities. And strictly speaking, vulnerabilities, just because somebody is a woman or a man, does not automatically mean that they are vulnerable. Because vulnerability is not coded in gender. Vulnerability is not coded in gender. Sorry, there's a fly that... Okay, vulnerability is not coded in gender, but rather inequality, cultural practices, or poverty discriminating against women's access to resources, knowledge, and power. So what basically this means is that there are intersections. We must look at these holistically, gender holistically, in terms of the various intersections that affect gender. Things like class, race, and age. Because even if we look at this room, the women who are in this particular room at this particular moment do not suffer the consequences of climate change in the same manner that a rural woman would do. And similarly, a woman who perhaps lives in Europe and a woman who lives in Africa, they do not suffer the consequences of climate change in the same manner. So we must look at vulnerabilities and gender at an intersection, as intersections, as things that, there are certain things that make women suffer climate change differently, disproportionately. And this also happens when it comes to men as well, because it can be argued that, but climate change also affects men. Yes, that is true, but they do not suffer at the same level, because some of the things that were mentioned here, like homelessness, I think when the presenter was talking about LGBTQ and whatnot, talking about homelessness, hunger, depression, domestic abuse, these are things that also affect women at a very different level because of access, because of maybe things to access to key resources and division of labor, which make it very difficult sometimes to participate in decision-making processes that affect women to deal with climate change issues. So this paper is basically anchored on feminist legal theory and intersectionality, because feminist legal theory as analytical tools will basically helps us to understand gender law and how the environment are related. I'm just going to rush through that because of time. Some of the critiques of legal and policy frameworks include the fact that there is an inadequate emphasis on gender considerations. We have policies like the National Climate Change Action Plan, the NCCAP, and the Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Strategy, the KCSAS, and the National Climate the National Climate Adaptation Strategy, the NCSA. What they do is, although we have these policies in place, what they do is they fail to include clear measures that would incorporate gender analysis in the planning and implementation. And this leads to, thank you, this leads to disaggregated data. We do not have sufficient data in this realm to know how climate change affects informed gender policies. So there's also a neglect of gender-specific issues in gender formulation. This is also contrary to international legal commitments that we've made in the Paris Agreement and United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which means that sometimes we come up with gender-blind policies emanating from a siloed approach to policy making, and which also lead to barriers to participation for women. We also have overlooking women's agency in climate change discourse. We also have deficiencies in legal safeguards for women encountering climate vulnerabilities. So although we have legal frameworks in place, these legal frameworks sometimes are not concomitant to lived realities of women. Because as we know, law in most cases is not neutral. Law is gendered. And since most of our policymakers and our legislators are male, most of the resulting legislation that comes from these houses of parliament are actually gendered and affect women in a specific manner. So what we need to do is to reframe women as agents of change in climate response. This is important. Just a minute. This is important. And to give examples, I'll give examples of women-led initiatives in Kenya. We can talk about the famous Green Belt movement. We all know about it. We also have the Women's Empowerment for Climate Change worker program, which addresses challenges of climate change at the community level. We also have the Mukuru Clean Stoves Initiative, which basically has innovative solutions in the context of an urbanization, clean energy. And just to wind up, some of the policy recommendations that I would suggest is we need to integrate gender considerations into climate policies. We need to promote equity in resource distribution and legal protections. This means funding women-led initiatives and efforts that target marginalized populations. We also need to guarantee inclusion of marginalized voices. And this is where maybe we have affirmative action programs and whatnot. And finally, we must enact gender-inclusive policies and legislation which increases capacity, by increasing capacity of legislators and policymakers to see the importance of having gender-specific legislation when it comes to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for this insightful presentation. I think it's very important to point out that not all women are affected equally, and you showed us how to look at this and differentiate accordingly. And you also showed us ways how to include women into decision-making processes, which is essential to create adequate legislation. So the next speakers will be Professor Gilbert Oboboyara from Egerton University and Professor Scott Jones from Oslo New University College. The topic will be politicized natural resource conflicts and peace building. And they will look at the gendered approach to environmental justice on the example of the River Rongai catchment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gudrun. I'll try to keep in the 7 minutes. We're looking at a grassroots research approach to conflict management and peace building. And as it is said, if there's no justice, there is no peace. So before we get to peace, then justice must be seen to be served. Our research is about a catchment that is utilized by a great number of stakeholders and interest groups. And because we have a multitude of stakeholders, they have competing interests, and these competing interests result into conflicts. And once these conflicts arise, then they have to be resolved, negotiated, or altogether done away with so that the community can live in peace. So we are dealing with, we didn't go to this school. Me and Scott did not go to this school, but we have learned a lot of things at that school in our old age. So we've been learning with small kids and communities around that place. So the first thing we would like to understand is the nature of natural resource conflicts in Kenya. And we are saying they are politicized. And this is challenging sustainable development and community cohesion, particularly in regions where resources are scarce and populations are growing. I think all of us can be able to associate with this statement that we are living in a largely competitive environment, both for resources and space. And so as our populations grow, we are likely to conflict over the use of these resources, simply because of some of the issues that have been raised here, due to access, tenure, rights, and so on. So the River Rongai catchment in Nakuru County exemplifies these challenges with a complex issue relating to water, land allocation, and environmental conservation. I think this is a picture that is common to most of us around January and February at the Ravine Junction. If you pass around there, you'll find these stones on the road. And there could be a lady who wants to go to the hospital to give us the next president of this country, and those stones will not allow her to go. There'll be a school-going kid who wants to go to school and they may not be able to go. And we'll see that some of these are actually arising from conflicts around Rongai. So our aim and study approach, we are focusing on applicability of this approach to other regions that are facing similar challenges. We would like to involve partnerships with local communities and other key stakeholders as equal partners in a locally agreed research process. And we would like to have active participation of women, youth, men, and marginalized groups to lay groundwork for the research and policy development. Our objectives stem on a respectful and inclusive research process, locally led as much as possible, and our initiatives will explore nature and underlying causes of conflicts, local initiatives that have sustained peace and prevented conflict escalation to date, and pathways to building consensus for gender equitable natural resource management, and then anchored solutions in local realities in understanding of justice, taking account of their sustainability given the effects of climate change. Actually, the Rongai issue has been hot, but it has never gone beyond hot to hotter. Somehow they managed to quell the embers of the fire and return to the ground and talk to themselves and be able to agree, maybe for a short time, but generally it has not gone to the level we have seen other conflicts go within the country. So what did we get from our initial research escapades with this community? And we are saying that we are seeing competing interests amongst stakeholders, especially farmers and pastoralists, government entities, private landowners and tenants, and conservation groups. So all these have interests within the Rongai catchment, and their interests intersect and they have problems with that. So we are looking at the role of communities in peace building, and we have community-based management with inclusive decision-making, conflict resolution mechanisms, grievance redress mechanisms, and sustainable resource management. We have seen successes and best practices exemplified in water user associations, participatory land use planning, women empowerment programs, and youth empowerment programs. And we are trying to see how these are anchored, these solutions are anchored, some of the solutions that are anchored in local realities, and the local understanding of justice. They are looking at local contexts of cultures, perceptions of justice, customary laws, and emphasis on communal ownership, equitable distribution, conflict resolution through elder councils and mediation committees. On the other side, we also have seen some sustainable solutions to climate change, exemplified in water conservation, climate resilient agriculture, and disaster risk reduction. We have also seen capacity building and peer-to-peer learning, where the farmers are learning from each other, and also there are structured capacity building activities like trainings on conflict management, which are actually facilitated by the two universities, that is Oslo New University College and Egerton University. Lessons learned to date revolve around inclusive governance, respecting and integrating customary law and practices, reconciling legal pluralism, where we have an intersection of statutory law and customary law. We have adaptive management and community empowerment. Okay, we acknowledge the River Rongai community, CISAM, which is our Center for Excellence in Agriculture and Agribusiness Management, FOLAP, and with that I say Asanteni, thank you, Tsitsi, vielen Dank, merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this insightful case study, Professor Gilbert. So we saw how you can, first of all, integrate women and other marginalized groups into decision-making, but especially important also in conflict management. So thanks again. The next speaker will be Wycliffe Riako. The speaker is a researcher and will talk about navigating intersectionality, gender inclusion, and climate justice in the face of environmental change in Kenya. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Everyone, good afternoon. Unluckily for me, my predecessor, Mr. Dundo, had made a good work in presenting my work. We have the same views, so I'll just rush through. So I'll give you a brief overview of the paper. I discuss the intersectionality and its application to climate justice. I then go ahead to discuss the policies, the legal frameworks, and the institutions in place. But then there is one thing that stands out. They do not have a gender-specific approach. They do not cater for the needs and the priorities of the women. And then I go ahead to discuss the impacts of climate change, specifically focusing again on the gender lens. The first area is agriculture and food security. How are women in food? Okay. Okay, let me just proceed. We then discuss water resources, health sector, and importantly, intimate partner violence. Then I proceed to look at the challenges and opportunities in this area. Allow me to put this into context. Consider a disabled woman probably expecting a kid in the informal areas of Kibra or extreme north of Mandera. Have that picture of a woman in your head, and then ask yourself, in the event that a climate-induced occurrence, in this case, let's say drought, floods, okay, how will these women cope? How will these women be affected? And then how severe does climate change affect their rights to land, to water, to clean energy? Bear in mind that this woman is expectant. I'm not speaking of an average woman. An expectant woman, either in the informal sectors or in the extreme areas. And then I discussed the factors, these intersectional factors. Which ones are they? We highlighted gender as a factor, age, religion. We have political affiliation. Recently we had, when there was a Senate proceeding, a senator saying that he was told that his area did not deserve help after a flood because they do not belong to the, political affiliation as the state. Then the challenges that really came out, I put them into two categories. One is culture and traditions. These cultures are so embedded in us. For instance, land ownership. In most cases, women don't own land. Even if they do, it's not in their name. Again, we have their roles as caregivers. In case of an emergency, women are the primary caregivers. The second area was inadequate gender perspective in response to climate change. This comes in areas of adaptation and mitigation. We put it there out that yes, women are taken care of, but which woman? Have we looked beyond the gender lens? In technology, again, in climate funding mechanisms, they did not take into account the specific needs, the specific priorities of women. Then I had 3 key recommendations. The first one is capacity building at the ground level. We need to go down to the lowest level, not just at the national level or at the international level. We need to come down to the mama mboga. Again, we need to take into account the specific priorities, needs, and roles of women in policies. We do not just say women when you're coming up with institutions. We consider, if it's Kisumu, what are the needs of women in Kisumu? If it's the Nakuru County government passing a legislation, they need to consider what are the priorities of the women in this county. Again, we need to strengthen the coalition, partnership, and alliances with local groups, the women chamas, the informal ones. They have the needs of their women at heart. When we go down to them, we handle their real needs. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Wycliffe Riako, for being so much on time and for giving you insights on how to integrate women's interests into climate policy. The last speaker is Vahu Wangari. The speaker is a legal researcher as well and will look at the question of international cooperation. So how can international mechanisms help to integrate gender interests into climate policy? So where is, yeah, okay. So Vahu, you have the floor.
Hi. So I think there was a typo. My title is Invisible Friends of the Earth, Reconciling Climate Justice and Gender Equality. I'm Wahu Wagare. Have you ever wondered why hurricanes have very sweet, innocent names? Katrina, Maria, Sandy, Hidaya, Helen. They sound like they should be offering you lemonade, not tearing up cities. Storm names have been fraught with sexism and sexist cliches, temperamental, teasing, tearing, tempestuous, arbitrarily associating women with disaster. Climate change lacks gender neutrality by disproportionately affecting women and girls and thus causing a double prejudice. I know some of you are thinking another angry feminist is here. Yes. My paper draws from Francois Dubon's ecofeminism theory that tries to connect the liberation of women to environmental liberation and connect and explore the intersection of gender and climate change through value hierarchical thinking and oppositional dualisms. Value hierarchical thinking looks at the way cultures in most setups assign greater value to certain groups of people, in most cases men over women, and oppositional dualisms represent the notion that men and women in most societies are seen as inherently different and opposite, thus reinforcing gender-based inequalities. I also look at the relationship between climate and gender, clearly pointing out that women, especially in developing countries, are more affected with the impact of climate change because of their traditionally and culturally assigned gender roles and responsibilities. This feminization of vulnerability often leads to an unequal impact, making women more susceptible to environmental degradation. If you grew up in a Kikuyu home like I did, you heard this more often than not. Ate ado modo moka ne dhakirio nariko. If I would translate that to my other language, Tholuo, Thuolo, I'll butcher this, Thuolo marngat mamiyo ni Egerton. Loosely translated to English, the place of a woman is in the kitchen. Despite the critical role that women play in climate adaptation because of their intimate knowledge of natural resources, community resilience, and agricultural practices, patriarchal structures continue to marginalize them from climate responses and climate decision making. So I also look at the current frameworks, national, regional, international, with regards to climate and gender, particularly Agenda 2030 on SDGs 5 and 12, on education and gender equality, and the United Nations Conference of Parties 25, which renews the Gender Action Plan, emphasizing the need for gender inclusion in climate strategies, 27, that focuses on adaptation and financing for vulnerable groups, including women, and 28, which launched the Gender Responsive Just Transitions and Climate Action Partnership that encourages focus on gender-sensitive data collection and monitoring, highlighting gender equality as a crucial factor in attaining the global climate targets. My paper uses Wangari Maathai, the 2024 Kenyan floods, and Cyclone Idai as case studies. As we know, Wangari Maathai's Greenbelt movement offered and continues to offer women with a local opportunity to take a lead in environmental conservation. However, despite the efforts that Wangari took to organize women to plant trees, combat deforestation, and advocate for environmental and gender rights, she faced systemic resistance as she was marginalized, harassed, and even jailed by the then male-dominated political regime. In fact, she said to note that as women go higher in the chain of policy influence, fewer women are found in positions of power. There are certain instances that show Wangari's social prejudice, which she faced, that were rooted in cultural norms that dictated that women should conform to traditional roles, such as subservience to men, and the obvious one, focus on household responsibilities. Go back to the kitchen. I think I have a video of one of the instances where Wangari was actually publicly attacked by the late President Moi for her efforts to stop the business development of Uhuru Park and destruction of Karura Forest. If you could help me.
If we are going to shed blood because of our land, we will. We are used to that. Our forefathers shed blood for our land. We will do so. This is my blood. And it reminds me of the blood they shed trying to protect Karura Forest.
It's a very sad saga that we have a government in this country that is actually overseeing the destruction of forests and the grabbing of public land.
If we are going to shed blood because of our land, we will. We are used to that. Our forefathers shed blood for our land. We will do so. This is my blood. And it reminds me of the blood they shed trying to protect Karura Forest.
It's a very sad saga that we have a government in this country that is actually overseeing the destruction of forests and the grabbing of public land.
Na mama moja anajitokeza na kwa desturi mama kwa Kiafrika lazima kuheshimu wanaume. Na mimi nauliza akina mama, muko wapi kutudiscipline mmoja wapo wenu ambaye amevuka mpaka?
So Wangari Maathai's work is very important as it reflects deeply entrenched patriarchal systems that continue to hinder the participation of women in climate responses. And though we have constitutional and legal frameworks that protect these rights, there are implementation gaps that exist to date. Though these legal frameworks are well-intentioned, they remain in what my human rights professor called a system of paper rights, recognized only in theory, but rarely put into practice with the urgency they deserve. While the COP process recognizes the intersection of gender and climate, there are certain barriers that exist, like implementation, which is caused by lack of political will, negative cultural practices, the lack of gender-inclusive financing with regards to climate change, which leads to gender-blind climate responses, and poverty and unequitable access to resources. The United Women 2022 poverty projections indicated that 62.8% of sub-Saharan Africa and the world's poor, 50%, are women. And therefore, I recommend, or my paper rather recommends, by looking at best practices in Bhutan, Zimbabwe, Uzbekistan, and Uruguay, the need to build capacity for women in climate decision-making by ensuring gender-inclusive climate financing and also focusing on gender-sensitive data collection and monitoring. As I conclude, I want to bring your attention to another woman, Jane Anyango Adika from Nyando in Kisumu County, who came to the limelight in 2012 after her iconic Serikali Saidia plea. I think
Aki jamani, maji imeingia mpaka nyumba yangu. Aki jamani, maji imeingia mpaka nyumba yangu. Vitu yote imeenda mpaka hata watoto, nimechukua watoto 3 tu, wengine sijui zimeenda wapi. Nyumba yangu imeenda na maji yote, na bwana yangu sijui alitoka ameenda wapi. Niko tu na watoto peke yangu. Serikali tafadhali, niko saidi mbaya kabisa. Vitu yote imeenda na maji ya haki serikali. Haki nimebaki tu bila kitu. Hakuna hata pale nitaenda na kulalia hata watoto. Vitu yote imeenda na maji ya haki serikali.
So, her cry for help, though initially humorous and fodder for jokes, indicated desperation of the fate of her children and the future. 12 years later after that video, women, though we have been in the front lines of fighting against climate justice and voicing its effect, we still remain invisible in climate decision and policy making. We need to incorporate and reconcile climate justice and gender equality in order to foster inclusivity in climate resistance. In the words of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, cultural norms, these cultural norms that continue to marginalize women are not static. Culture is not static, it keeps evolving. Culture does not make people, it is people that make culture. Therefore, we have the power to create a culture of equality, one that fosters inclusivity and resilience against climate change and ensures every person is brought into board. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Vahu, for your very, impressive presentation and the call to change the culture. So thank you for all the speakers for their presentations, Caroline, Collins, Gilbert, Wycliffe, and Vahu. We heard about possibilities to identify women's and marginalized group-specific problems of climate change policies. We heard about ways to integrate their views in decision-making, but also in dispute settlement and conflict resolutions. We have time, well, we have 7 minutes to discuss, yeah, so, yeah, if there are questions, please raise your hand.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a comment, maybe a follow-on question that I think I'd like all the presenters that have spoken to possibly consider in the papers. I think increasingly in the gendering of the climate discourse, we are seeing a feminization of vulnerability, almost as if it's only women in the most marginalized communities who are vulnerable. And I'm just thinking maybe as part of the research, as you guys are working on the papers, it would be worth looking at the fact that women are not a homogeneous group, because even for the women sitting in this room, we have the impacts of climate change that don't necessarily speak to the vulnerabilities that, say, our sisters in Wajir, for instance, are experiencing. So it's just a call to say, can we guard against feminization of the vulnerabilities of women, because women are not homogeneous? I think that's the first comment. And then the second comment that I would also like to make, particularly for the last presentation, I'm glad to see an angry feminist in the room. I think we've heard a lot about gender-inclusive financing. And I keep asking myself, what does it look like? Because I'm also, just listening to the presentations of the frames, I'm not sure that I see where the specificities of what we mean by gender-inclusive financing for climate action. And maybe it's again a call to say, as you work on the papers, can we be very specific? Because one of the things that I find, particularly when you talk about gender and inclusion, is we tend to have broad strokes of, gender inclusion, how do you say gender inclusion, gendered approaches. But what does that actually mean? And what does it actually look like? And I think for me, that's something that I really would like the papers to address. Thank you very much.
For me, I stand guided on my opinion. Among all the presentations that I've seen, most people have focused on women only. I've not seen any chauvinistic perspective on climate change, and we know that gender means the characteristics of men and women that are socially construed. So I think that going forward, we should not only base ourselves on women only. Like, men also go through these things, and most of them can't stand on television and shout like that lady, Serikali Saidia. Some of them will just go and drink beer and end up dying with their problems. You see, so let's not only focus on women, and then at the end of the day, we find that Professor Mbote and UNEP have only construed laws on women and left men outside. You see, it's not true. Yeah, so my perspective is let's fight for our men too.
Okay, good afternoon. Yes, my name is Loko Suebenyo, an alumni of Egerton University. Yes, so this one has been raised before, but just to add a voice, it's also on the mainstream of gender inclusivity in matters climate justice, and this is a comment as much as it is a wake-up call. And this comment is coming from I, as a feminist, and a great believer and supporter of women in matters climate. So, in fact, it has been a sad moment for me, being a feminist, hearing all the presenters on gender and climate just being so much focused into women and climate change. I was expecting that one of them could have focused on men and climate change. This being, at times, men have been into economic activities in urban areas, and they forget climate change mitigation back in their villages. Then we've seen one of the speakers taking us back to 2004. Yet, after that, we've seen women serving in very high positions in this country, especially in the judiciary. We've also seen a woman as a cabinet secretary for environment in this government. So, despite all these efforts being made, we've not yet seen any laws under her leadership encouraging women in matters environment. So it's high time that women wake up. It's not about crying. So, so it's high time you also wake up and get involved in matters environment. Yes, also, also for men. Yes, for men, we were expecting to see some of the law-specific trying to address men issues around climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I will do some closing remarks and we can continue this very lively discussion at lunch. I think this is quite interesting, and probably we should really more move to identifying specifically marginalized groups. We had one presentation from Ronald about the LGBTQ plus group, so it was not just about women, but one of the presenters, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name, he really suggested not all women are equally affected, but we have to look at the specific vulnerabilities. And I guess this applies not just to women, but to men as well. So it may be people having specific diseases, yeah. But there may also be other elements we have to look for and we have to consider when we draft climate change policies. With that said, I think we'll have some more presentations on the issue in the afternoon. Now we have time for lunch. I'm not sure how long lunch, Ruth, do you know how long Ruth? Sorry, how long is the lunch break? Okay, no more lunch? Yeah, no more lunch? "45 minutes of lunch break to discuss the issues further, and I guess we have to rush. Thank you very much for the very interesting session."
A round of applause, please, to Professor Gudrun. Thank you so much for leading that session. Kindly pick your meal vouchers at the doors. We have Beatrice and our colleague there, Kenani, who will be issuing the meal vouchers. Asante.